Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight. Find a comfortable position, let the day slowly fade away, and allow yourself to simply listen. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be, and nothing expected of you except to relax. As our story unfolds, you can follow every detail, or simply let the sound of my voice carry you gently towards sleep. Now let's begin. Imagine a land stretching as far as the eye can see, vast forests, fertile fields, and sprawling coastlines. This was colonial America, a patchwork of settlements brimming with potential, yet teetering on the edge of something monumental. What could possibly disrupt this seemingly endless tranquility? Across the ocean in London, King George III held a very different view of this land. He firmly believed in absolute royal authority, the idea that he ruled by divine right and his word was law, and he wanted America to know it. How far would he push to maintain control? Meanwhile, in Boston, things were changing. This bustling port city became a melting pot of ideas and ambitions. Colonists weren't just subjects of the crown, they forged their own identity, a distinctly American one. But could this burgeoning sense of independence truly take root? Enter Samuel Adams, a man who understood that power wasn't just held by kings and parliaments. He believed it resided in the people, and he knew how to stir them. Imagine a voice, quiet at first, then growing louder, planting seeds of discontent. What kind of trouble could one man cause? Then came the French and Indian War, a brutal conflict that reshaped North America. When it ended, Britain found itself saddled with an enormous debt. Parliament decided, rather predictably, that the colonies should help foot the bill. What did they expect? The news arrived in America like a thunderclap. The Stamp Act. Suddenly, everything, from newspapers to playing cards, required a tax stamp. Colonists felt directly targeted, their rights seemingly trampled upon. How could they possibly accept this? The response was immediate and unified. Representatives from 9 colonies gathered in New York for the Stamp Act Congress, a bold move to formally challenge British authority. But would this show of unity be enough to sway Parliament? Back in Britain, merchants began to feel the pinch. Colonial boycotts of British goods were crippling trade. The economic pressure mounted, forcing Parliament to reconsider its position. Could wallets speak louder than royal decrees? The Stamp Act was repealed, a victory for the colonists. But it wasn't over yet. Parliament quickly passed the Declaratory Act, stubbornly asserting its right to legislate for the colonies. A win, or a warning shot across the bow. The brief respite wouldn't last. Soon after the Stamp Act's repeal came the Townshend Acts, new taxes on goods like tea and glass. Resentment bubbled once more, threatening to boil over into something far more dangerous. Was this just a matter of time? The British government kept imposing taxes, and colonial merchants weren't thrilled, so they began smuggling goods, rerouting them to avoid those duties altogether. It wasn't a few ships, it became widespread practice. This wasn't petty theft, it was a quiet act of defiance, demonstrating that the colonists wouldn't simply accept Parliament's dictates without question, and it set the stage for something much bigger. To enforce these laws, Britain sent more troops, not just a few, but whole regiments stationed in Boston. Imagine that, soldiers everywhere you look. It wasn't about protecting the colonists, it was about asserting control. This created an incredibly tense atmosphere as resentment simmered beneath the surface and civilians felt increasingly watched and harassed facing armed British regulars. How long could this uneasy peace last? Then came that fateful day, March 5, 1770. What started as a minor scuffle between civilians and soldiers quickly escalated. Rocks were thrown, insults hurled, and then shots rang out. 5 colonists lay dead or wounded. It was called the Boston Massacre, but it became something much more, a powerful symbol of British oppression. Samuel Adams and other colonial leaders seized upon this tragedy. Paul Revere, a silversmith and patriot, created an engraving depicting the event. It wasn't entirely accurate. He took some artistic license, but it powerfully portrayed British soldiers firing mercilessly into unarmed civilians. The image spread like wildfire through the colonies, igniting outrage and solidifying anti-British sentiment. Suddenly, reconciliation seemed almost impossible. Years later, Parliament passed the Tea Act, designed to bail out the struggling British East India Company. Act sounds good on paper, right? But it effectively gave the company a monopoly on tea sales in America. Colonists saw it as another blatant attempt at unfair taxation and control. It wasn't about the price of tea, it was about principle. What would they do now? And then, the Boston Tea Party. A group of colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships in Boston Harbor and dumped chests upon chests of tea into the water. Ephibiwath. It was a bold, dramatic act of defiance, an unmistakable message to Britain: we will not be pushed around. The harbour turned brown with tea leaves. But would this action provoke a reaction even more severe? Britain's response was swift and brutal. The coercive acts, or, as colonists called them, the intolerable acts. These laws were designed to punish Massachusetts and assert British authority. They closed Boston Harbor, restricted colonial self-government. But did Britain understand what they were doing? Because these acts weren't crushing dissent, they were fueling it. Delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They knew they needed to respond, but how? How? Should they petition the king, boycott British goods? The debates were fierce, the stakes incredibly high. It was a moment of unity among colonists who had often been divided. Tension escalated further as colonial militias began stockpiling weapons and ammunition, secretly, quietly. Farmers and shopkeepers were learning to drill, preparing for a confrontation they hoped could be avoided but increasingly knew was coming. Was this the end of compromise? Was armed conflict now unavoidable? Then, on April 19, 1775, Lexington and Concord, a shot rang out, the shot heard round the world. It's unclear who fired first, but that moment changed everything. The American Revolution had begun, blood would be spilled, and a new nation would be born. The tension had been simmering for months. Then, in April of 75, it boiled over. British troops marched toward Concord to seize colonial arms, a move that was met with fierce resistance from local militia. A brief skirmish at Lexington quickly escalated into open conflict. Shots rang out, and men fell on both sides. What started as a tense standoff transformed into the first bloodshed of what would become the American Revolution. The news flew like wildfire. Lexington and Concord were in flames. It ignited a spark across the colonies. Ordinary citizens, farmers, shopkeepers. Suddenly they weren't just protesting taxes, they were facing armed conflict with Great Britain. But who would answer the call to arms? Could these disparate communities rally behind a shared cause? With that news spreading, representatives from across the colonies gathered in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress. They faced a monumental decision. Declare independence? It was a leap into the unknown, severing ties with the most powerful empire on earth. Could they truly forge their own nation? The Congress needed leadership, someone to unite these disparate militias into an effective fighting force. They chose George Washington, a Virginia planter with experience commanding colonial troops in the French and Indian War. But could he, a man of quiet dignity, truly forge unity from such a diverse group? Then came common sense. Thomas Paine's pamphlet wasn't eloquent poetry. It was direct, blunt, and powerful. He argued that monarchy itself was unjust, that independence was not just desirable, but inevitable. And what a spark it ignited. Suddenly the idea of separation from Britain seemed not radical, but reasonable. Common sense fueled a surge in revolutionary fervor. Colonial militias, previously operating independently, started to formally organize into Continental Army units. But enthusiasm wasn't enough. They lacked uniforms, proper weapons, and years of training. How would they stand against the might of the British Army? The first major test arrived quickly. The Siege of Boston. Colonial forces attempted to blockade the city, hoping to starve British troops into submission, a desperate gamble. But would this bold move pay off, or would it simply expose their lack of experience? Initial attempts to dislodge the British from Boston proved disastrous. Colonial artillery was inaccurate, and their fortifications flimsy. Washington's army suffered repeated setbacks, a painful reminder of just how immense the challenge before them truly was. But what next? Could he turn this defeat into an opportunity? Then Washington devised a daring plan: seize cannons from Fort Ticonderoga and strategically position them on Dorchester Heights, directly overlooking Boston. It was a gamble, a bold move that caught the British completely off guard. Suddenly, their situation in Boston became untenable. The British had no choice but to evacuate. The successful siege of Boston was a pivotal moment, a massive morale boost for the Continental Army. It showcased Washington's strategic brilliance and gave hope to those who doubted independence could be achieved. But victory, it seemed, would be fleeting. News arrived from New York. British reinforcements were on their way. The summer of '76 had faded, leaving behind a grim reality. The British, with their superior numbers and control of the seas, prepared to crush Washington's fledgling army. New York City became a brutal battleground, leaving American forces reeling. One defeat followed another. It felt hopeless. Morale plummeted as supplies dwindled. Could Washington possibly turn the tide? Driven back across New Jersey, Washington's army was in full retreat. They were harried by British patrols at every turn, forced to abandon equipment and desperately ration dwindling supplies. Desertion became a constant threat. Men simply walked away, unable to endure the hardship. The situation seemed utterly dire. Many questioned if the revolution could survive this crushing setback, but Washington wasn't ready to give up. Can one desperate gamble change everything? It was a gamble born of desperation. A daring raid on Hessian troops garrisoned in Trenton, Christmas night, 1776. Under the cover of darkness and a driving snowstorm, Washington led his men across the icy Delaware River. The surprise attack caught the Hessians completely off guard, resulting in an unexpected American victory. It was a much-needed spark of hope. But one win doesn't win a war. What will Washington do next? The victory at Trenton was just the beginning. Washington seized the momentum, crossing the Delaware again to capture Princeton in another hard-fought battle. Suddenly, confidence began to return to the Continental Army. Men who had been ready to desert were now eager to fight. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the tide might be turning. However, winter was fast approaching, and with it new challenges. What would become of these newly emboldened troops? As winter's grip tightened, Washington made the difficult decision to establish winter quarters at Valley Forge. What followed was a period of unimaginable hardship. Soldiers faced starvation, disease ran rampant through the camp, and desertion continued to plague the ranks. It was a brutal test of endurance. Could the army survive the winter? Just when hope seemed lost, a savior arrived, Baron Friedrich von Steuben. This Prussian military officer possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of European warfare and was eager to transform the ragtag Continental Army into a disciplined fighting force. He instituted rigorous training drills, standardized procedures, and instilled a sense of order that had been sorely lacking. But would his methods be enough to overcome years of inexperience? News began to trickle in from across the Atlantic. News of potential French support, American victories, coupled with strategic calculations regarding Great Britain's global power, had piqued France's interest. The prospect of a powerful ally offering military and financial assistance offered a glimmer of hope for the struggling cause. But could this foreign aid truly turn the tide? Revitalized by Steuben's training and buoyed by the promise of French aid, the Continental Army prepared to face renewed British aggression in the summer of 1777. The men were stronger, more disciplined, and armed with a newfound sense of purpose. But their next target was carefully chosen. A strategic move that could change everything. What bold plan did Washington have in mind? At Saratoga, New York, American forces achieved a stunning victory over a British army. The news reverberated across the Atlantic and in Paris, prompting France to formally recognize American independence and enter the war as an ally. It was a turning point, a moment that fundamentally shifted the balance of power. But what did this new alliance mean for Britain? With France now on their side, the Americans suddenly had access to much-needed military supplies, naval support, and financial resources. The war was far from over, but the tide had definitively turned against Great Britain, a global superpower now facing a formidable new challenge. But what sacrifices still lay ahead for both sides? France was in, a game-changer, without question. Suddenly, America's fight for freedom became part of a larger global power struggle. Britain now faced not only the Continental Army but also France's formidable military and financial strength. This meant years more conflict, a protracted war stretching across land and sea. Would this new alliance be enough to tip the scales, or would Great Britain ultimately crush the rebellion?